There is a place on this earth so small you could fit it inside the state of Oregon, with room to spare. A collection of islands perched at the far northwestern edge of Europe, battered by grey Atlantic weather, wrapped in fog for half the year, cut off from the continent by a thin stretch of choppy grey sea. By the measurements of the physical world, it is unremarkable. It has no vast plains, no great rivers, no mountain ranges that would impress a geologist. Its highest peak is not quite 5,000 feet. Its longest river stretches barely 220 miles. In geological terms, it is a fragment, a leftover, a piece of old rock that broke away from the European mainland and drifted slowly into the sea. And yet, from this small, fog-covered fragment of the world came the language you are listening to right now. From these islands came the legal traditions that underpin the courts of dozens of nations. From here came the literature of Shakespeare, Milton, Austen, Dickens, Orwell. From here came the Industrial Revolution, which remade the physical fabric of human civilization within the space of a single lifetime. From here came an empire so vast that at its peak it covered roughly a quarter of the Earth's entire land surface and governed 1 in 4 human beings alive on the planet. Britain is not remarkable because of its geography. Britain is remarkable because of everything that happened there. And what happened there is a story of extraordinary, unrelenting depth. It begins not with kings or cathedrals or empire, but with ice. With glaciers a mile thick pressing down on bare rock. With a land so frozen and so hostile that no human being could survive there. And it ends, for now, in a modern island nation navigating the 21st century, carrying within its institutions and its landscape and its language the accumulated weight of 15,000 years of continuous, tumultuous, astonishing human history. That is the story we are going to tell tonight, all of it, or as much of all of it as we can hold in a single sitting. This is the entire history of Britain, from the Ice Age to now. If you are watching this to sleep, then let me say simply, you are welcome here. The light is low. The world outside can wait. Tonight, we are going to travel back to the very beginning of this island's human story, and we are going to walk through every age, every invasion, every dynasty, every catastrophe, and every triumph, all the way to the present. Let it wash over you. There is nothing you need to remember. There is nothing you need to do. Just listen. And if this is the kind of content that helps you rest, consider subscribing. It helps more than you know. And leave a comment before you drift off. Tell me where you are in the world and what drew you to the history of these rainy, complicated, endlessly fascinating islands. I read every single one. Now, let us begin. The ice came not once but many times. Over the course of the last 2.5 million years, the Earth has passed through repeated cycles of glaciation. Periods in which temperatures dropped sharply across the northern hemisphere and vast ice sheets advanced from the polar regions, covering enormous swaths of land that are today temperate and green. Britain experienced these cycles intimately. At the peak of the most recent glaciation, roughly 25,000 years ago, an ice sheet more than a mile thick covered everything. North of what is today the Thames Valley, Scotland, Wales, the north of England, all of it buried under a weight of ice, so immense it pressed the bedrock of the island down into the Earth's crust by hundreds of feet. Beneath the ice, there was no life. Above the ice, there was no life. Britain, in those millennia, was as empty and as silent as the surface of the moon. But even during the most intense periods of glaciation, the ice was never permanent in the south. There were warmer intervals, known as interstadials, when the ice retreated and the land briefly opened. And during those intervals, remarkable things happened. Animals moved in from the south and east across what was then dry land connecting Britain to the European continent, because sea levels were far lower than they are today. Mammoths, woolly rhinoceroses, cave lions, hyenas, reindeer, and tentatively, following the herds across that exposed landscape, human beings. The oldest confirmed evidence of human presence in Britain dates to roughly 900,000 years ago. Not Homo sapiens, our own species, but an earlier human relative, possibly Homo antecessor, who left behind flint, tools and footprints preserved in ancient coastal sediments at Happisburgh in Norfolk. Those footprints, discovered in 2013 and dated with remarkable precision, are the oldest human footprints ever found outside of Africa. They are the marks of a family group, adults and children, walking along the edge of an ancient estuary on a day that has been dead for nearly 1 million years. After them came others. Different species, different intervals. Homo heidelbergensis, who occupied Britain during a warm period around 400,000 years ago and left behind extraordinary evidence at Boxgrove in West Sussex, including a shin bone and teeth, alongside the butchered remains of rhinoceroses and horses. These were not simple creatures. They made carefully crafted hand axes, symmetrical and beautiful, and they hunted large animals in coordinated groups. They were followed, in later warmer phases, by Neanderthals, who occupied Britain repeatedly between roughly 400,000 and 40,000 years ago, and left abundant archaeological evidence of their presence, their tools, their use of fire, their burial of their dead. And then the last great glaciation arrived, and for a long time, Britain was empty again. The ice reached its maximum extent around 25,000 years ago. Then, slowly, it began to retreat. By 14,000 years ago, the climate was warming rapidly. The great ice sheets were pulling back toward the far north. The tundra that had stretched across southern Britain began to give way to grassland, then to scrub, then to the first returning trees. Birch came first, then pine, then hazel, and elm and oak. The landscape was transforming at a pace that, by geological standards, was nearly instantaneous. The returning animals led the way, as they always do. First the reindeer and horses that thrive in cold open country, then the red deer and aurochs that prefer woodland, and alongside them, always, human hunters. The people who moved back into Britain in those early post-glacial millennia were Homo sapiens, our own kind. They were anatomically modern in every sense. They had the same bodies we have, the same cognitive capacities, the same range of emotional and social complexity. They were not primitive in any meaningful sense of that word. They were fully formed human beings living in a world that happened to be organized very differently from ours. They lived in small mobile groups. They followed the herds. They camped along riverbanks and at cave mouths. They made tools from flint and bone. They wore clothing from animal skins. They almost certainly had rich spoken languages, complex social relationships, belief systems, stories, songs, rituals. We know almost nothing of those things, because the things that survive in the archaeological record are the things that do not decay. Stone, bone, occasionally charcoal from ancient fires. But here and there, the record offers us something more. At Gough's Cave in the Cheddar Gorge in Somerset, archaeologists have found the bones of people who were eaten. Not by animals, but by other people. The bones show marks consistent with cannibalism, with deliberate defleshing and the cracking of skulls to access the brain. This was not, we think, simple predatory violence. The patterns suggest ritual, ceremony, something more deliberate and more strange than simple hunger. These were Ice Age people, engaging in practices we cannot fully understand. They were complicated. They had inner lives. And some of those inner lives encompassed acts we find deeply disturbing. Also at Gough's Cave, and at other sites across Britain, the evidence of a simpler, more moving kind of human continuity. In 2018, scientists extracted DNA from the skeleton of a man who had died in the Cheddar Gorge around 10,000 years ago, a man known informally as Cheddar Man. Analysis of that DNA revealed that he had dark skin, blue eyes, and dark curly hair, that he was lactose intolerant, that he was genetically closest to populations in modern-day Spain and Hungary, and crucially, that he shares DNA with people living in the same area of Somerset today, 10,000 years later. A local history teacher named Adrian Target carries DNA that connects him, across an almost incomprehensible span of time, to a man whose bones were found in a cave less than a mile from where he grew up. 10,000 years, the same piece of land, the same genetic thread. That is the kind of fact that makes you feel the weight of deep time in your bones. Britain, in those early post-glacial millennia, was still connected to the rest of Europe. This is something we often forget when we think about British history, because the image of Britain as an island, separated from the continent by the English Channel, is so deeply embedded in our sense of what Britain is. But for thousands of years after the ice retreated, there was no English Channel. Where the channel now lies, there was a wide low-lying plain, probably forested, certainly inhabited, through which rivers flowed and animals moved, and people walked freely between what is now Britain and what is now the Netherlands, Belgium, and northern France. Geologists and archaeologists have given this lost landscape a name: Doggerland. It takes its name from the Doggerbank, a shallow region of the North Sea, where fishing trawlers still occasionally pull up the bones of mammoths and woolly rhinoceroses, and sometimes ancient human artifacts. Doggerland was not a barren place. In those warmer, wetter, post-glacial centuries, it was probably rich with resources: rivers full of fish, wetlands full of wildfowl, forests full of game. People lived there. We know this because we keep finding their things in the sea. But the sea was rising. As the ice sheets melted, the meltwater flowed into the world's oceans, raising sea levels at a rate that, while slow by human lifetime standards, was relentless and irreversible. Over thousands of years, the sea crept across Doggerland. The low plains flooded first, then the river valleys, then the higher ground. The people who had lived there either moved to higher ground or followed the retreating land, northward and westward. And finally, around 8,000 years ago, possibly in a single catastrophic event triggered by a massive underwater landslide off the coast of Norway, the last land bridge between Britain and Europe was submerged. Britain became an island, and everything that followed in its history was shaped, in ways both obvious and subtle, by that fact. The people living in Britain when it became an island were Mesolithic hunter-gatherers. Mesolithic means Middle Stone Age, the period between the end of the Ice Age and the arrival of farming. These were skilled and adaptable people. They knew their landscape intimately. They knew which plants were edible and when, which rivers held fish and in what seasons, where the deer went in winter and where they came in summer. They were not wandering randomly. They were moving through a landscape they understood deeply, following patterns and rhythms they had learned over generations. The evidence they left behind is sparse, but it is there. At Starcar in Yorkshire, excavated from the early 1950s onward, archaeologists found the remains of a lakeside settlement dating to around 9,000 years ago. They found worked antler, red deer, skull caps with the antlers still attached, possibly worn as headdresses in rituals or hunting disguises. They found worked wood, including the remains of what appears to be a platform built at the edge of the lake. And beneath it all, the remains of the lake itself, preserved for 9,000 years under layers of peat. Starcar is one of the richest Mesolithic sites in Europe, but it is, in the grand scheme of British prehistory, just a glimpse. Most of what the Mesolithic people of Britain left behind has long since decayed or been buried or washed away. They are present in the landscape only in fragments, but they were here, they were real. And when the next great change came, the change that would transform not just Britain, but the entire human world, they were already here to receive it. Farming arrived in Britain, not as an invasion, but as a tide. Around 6,000 years ago, a new way of life began to spread northwestward across Europe from its origins in the ancient Near East. This was the Neolithic Revolution, the shift from hunting and gathering to farming and herding, from following the natural world to actively reshaping it. People in the Fertile Crescent had been farming for thousands of years by the time farming reached Britain. But when it arrived with remarkable force. Genetic evidence now tells us clearly that the Neolithic transformation of Britain was not simply the local Mesolithic population adopting new practices. It was, to a very significant degree, a population replacement. New people arrived, probably by boat across the Channel and the North Sea, from farming communities in continental Europe. They were genetically distinct from the hunter-gatherers who were already there, and over the course of the following centuries, the genetic signature of those original hunter-gatherers largely disappeared from the British record. This does not mean there was a violent extermination. Population dynamics are rarely that simple. More likely, there was a complex, drawn-out process of displacement, absorption, intermarriage, and demographic change, driven by the simple reality that farming communities, when they have access to enough land, tend to grow faster than hunter-gatherer populations. Over generations, the farmers came to outnumber the hunters, and the hunters, in whatever form they survived, became part of the farming world or retreated to its margins. What the Neolithic farmers built is extraordinary. They built the first permanent settlements Britain had ever seen. Rectangular timber longhouses, some of them over 30 meters long, housing extended family groups and their animals. They cleared vast areas of forest, opening the land for fields and pasture. They kept cattle and sheep and pigs. They grew emmer wheat and einkorn. They made pottery, the first pottery ever seen in Britain, shaped by hand and fired in open hearths. And they built monuments. The Neolithic people of Britain were among the world's most prolific builders of megalithic monuments, structures made from enormous, carefully shaped and transported stones, raised in patterns and arrangements that were clearly meaningful to the people who built them, even if their meaning is no longer fully transparent to us. Long barrows, the great earthen and stone mounds beneath which the Neolithic dead were interred, sometimes collectively, over generations. Causewayed enclosures, ringed earthworks whose function remains debated, but which seem to have served as gathering places, perhaps for seasonal festivals, perhaps for the exchange of goods and people, perhaps for the processing of the dead. Cursuses, long parallel ditches, stretching for miles across the landscape, whose purpose is almost entirely mysterious. And then there is Stonehenge. Stonehenge is the most famous prehistoric monument in the world, and it is famous for good reason. But the Stonehenge we picture, the dramatic ring of massive standing stones on Salisbury Plain, is the final product of a building process that stretched over more than 1,500 years. The monument we see today was not built all at once. It grew and changed and was remodeled across generations. From around 5,000 years ago to around 3,500 years ago, and each phase represents the intentions and labor of people separated from each other by centuries. The earliest phase of Stonehenge was not stones at all. It was a circular earthwork, a ditch and bank enclosure, with a series of small pits arranged inside it. The pits held cremated human remains. Stonehenge, from its very beginning, was a place of the dead. The stones came later. The smaller blue stones, weighing up to 4 tons each, were brought from the Priestley Hills in southwest Wales, a journey of at least 200 miles that required extraordinary organisation and effort, and almost certainly the use of watercraft to cross the Bristol Channel. Why were stones from Wales specifically chosen? Why were they transported such an impossible distance when perfectly adequate stone was available locally? We do not know. There is a theory that the Priestley Hills were already considered a sacred or healing landscape. that the blue stones carried some significance that made the enormous labor of their transport worthwhile. But it remains a theory. The great sarsen stones, the massive grey uprights and lintels that form the iconic silhouette of Stonehenge, came from Marlborough Downs, around 25 miles to the north. They weigh up to 25 tons each. Moving them across the chalk downland of Wiltshire required the organised labour of hundreds of people, working with ropes, levers, wooden sledges, and a coordination of effort that staggers the imagination. When you think about what was available to these people, and they were placed with astronomical precision. The axis of Stonehenge is aligned with the rising sun on midsummer morning and the setting sun on midwinter evening. Whether this was a calendar, a ritual focus, or something we have no modern concept for, it was intentional. These people understood the movements of the sun with careful, systematic observation. They embedded that knowledge in stone, in a monument they expected to last forever. It has lasted 5,000 years so far. It is still standing on Salisbury Plain tonight. The Bronze Age arrived in Britain around 4,200 years ago, and it arrived alongside another wave of migration from continental Europe. The genetic evidence is startling. Analysis of ancient DNA from Bronze Age burials in Britain shows that around this time, the genetic ancestry of the population shifted dramatically. Again, a new group of people associated archaeologically with what is known as the Bell Beaker culture moved into Britain in large numbers. They came from the steppes of Central Europe, originally of ancestry, connected to the vast grasslands east of the Ural Mountains. And within a few centuries, their genetic signature came to dominate the population. By the middle of the Bronze Age, the genetic profile of Britain had been remade for the third time. These were not just new genes. They brought new things. They brought the knowledge of metalworking, the ability to smelt copper and to mix it with tin to produce bronze, a harder and more versatile material that could hold an edge in ways stone never could. They brought new forms of pottery, new burial practices, single graves under round barrows, the individual honoured separately rather than interred collectively with ancestors, new weapons, new prestige objects, a new world. The Bronze Age in Britain lasted for around 1,500 years, and across that span, the landscape was transformed more completely than it had been in any previous period. Bronze Age people farmed intensively. They organised their land into field systems, some of which can still be traced from the air in certain kinds of light. They built roundhouses, circular timber-framed dwellings covered with thatch, warm and practical in the wet British climate. They accumulated wealth in ways the Neolithic people had not, or at least had not done in the same forms. Hoards of bronze objects, weapons and tools and jewellery, buried in the earth or deposited in rivers and lakes, offerings to whatever powers they believed governed their world. The rivers, in particular, received enormous quantities of valuable objects throughout the Bronze Age and into the Iron Age that followed. Swords, shields, helmets, cauldrons, all cast into water as deliberate acts of giving. The Thames, over centuries, has yielded quantities of bronze weaponry that represent astonishing investments of labour and material. Why were they thrown into the river? The most persuasive explanation is that rivers, as boundaries between worlds, as things that moved and had their own power and could carry things away to unknown places, were understood as interfaces with supernatural forces, places where gifts could pass from this world into another. This is one of the ways Bronze Age Britain speaks to us most clearly across the millennia. Not in texts, because they left no texts, but in the choices they made about what was worth giving away forever. The Bronze Age ended, as ages tend to end, not with a dramatic single event, but with a long, complex transition. The technology of iron working spread westward across Europe, and iron, though initially harder to work than bronze, had crucial advantages. Iron ore was far more abundant and widespread than tin, making the metal accessible to communities that had previously depended on long-distance trade networks for their raw materials. And iron, properly worked, could produce harder and sharper tools than most bronze. By around 800 years before the Common Era, the Iron Age had begun in Britain. The Iron Age is when Britain begins to take on something recognizable to modern eyes. The people we call Celts, though that term is contentious and probably covers a more diverse range of peoples than the single word suggests, occupied Britain throughout the Iron Age, alongside a broader northwestern European cultural world connected by trade, shared artistic traditions, and related languages. The languages spoken in Iron Age Britain were ancestral to Welsh, Cornish, Scots Gaelic, Irish and Breton, the languages that today we call the Celtic languages. They were the dominant tongues of Britain until the Romans arrived and Latin established itself in the towns, and until the Anglo-Saxons arrived and replaced them across most of England. But they never disappeared. They survive today, spoken by living people, the oldest continuous linguistic tradition in Britain. The Iron Age Britons were farmers and warriors. They lived in roundhouses clustered into settlements of various sizes, from small farmsteads to substantial villages. They built hill forts, defended settlements perched on high ground and surrounded by elaborate earthwork ramparts, some of them enclosing areas large enough to shelter entire communities. Maiden Castle in Dorset is the most impressive surviving example, a vast, complex system of ramparts and ditches covering 47 acres, capable of housing thousands of people. At its peak in the 1st century, before the Common Era, Maiden Castle was effectively a small town. Iron Age society was hierarchical and competitive. The warrior aristocracy held power and prestige, demonstrated through feasting, gift-giving, and the display of fine objects. The Celtic smiths produced metalwork of breathtaking artistry. The flowing, interlaced, curvilinear designs of what we call Latène style, seen in torques and mirrorbacks and chariot fittings, represent one of the great artistic traditions of the ancient world. The Battersea Shield, pulled from the Thames in 1857, decorated with swirling Latène spirals picked out in red enamel, is among the most beautiful objects ever made in Britain, and it was made around 2,200 years ago by someone whose name we will never know. The Iron Age Britons were not isolated. They were deeply embedded in continental trade networks, exchanging tin, slaves, cattle hides, and hunting dogs for wine, oil, and luxury goods from the Mediterranean world. Greek and Roman writers wrote about them, sometimes with admiration, sometimes with horror, sometimes with the casual condescension of people who considered themselves at the center of civilization and everyone else at its fringes. Julius Caesar famously invaded Britain twice, in 55 and 54 BCE, and left written accounts of what he found: a land of chariot warriors, of tribes with complex alliances and bitter feuds, of priests called druids, who held enormous power and who, Caesar claims, presided over human sacrifice. How much of this was accurate and how much was Roman propaganda designed to justify conquest is something historians still debate. Caesar's Britain was useful to Caesar politically. He needed it to be both impressive enough to justify the effort of invasion and barbaric enough to justify Roman intervention. His invasions did not lead to occupation. He extracted tribute promises and political hostages and withdrew. Britain remained independent for another century. In the year 43 of the Common Era, the Emperor Claudius sent 4 legions, approximately 40,000 soldiers, across the Channel into Britain. This was the beginning of nearly 4 centuries of Roman rule, and it transformed Britain more thoroughly than anything that had come before. The invasion was not unopposed. The British tribes met the Roman army in a series of fierce engagements, most famously at the Battle of the Medway in Kent, a 2-day battle that the Romans won through discipline, tactical sophistication, and the use of auxiliary troops who could swim across the river in full equipment to attack the British flank. The British forces, led by tribal kings, including Caratacus and Togodumnus of the Catuvalauni, fought hard but could not match the Roman war machine. Claudius himself crossed to Britain briefly, in time to oversee the ceremonial capture of Camulodunum, modern Colchester, which became the first Roman capital of the new province of Britannia. He stayed 17 days and then left his generals to continue the conquest. The conquest of the south and east was relatively rapid. The conquest of the north and west took far longer. Wales was not subdued until the 70s CE. The far north of what is now Scotland was never conquered at all, and the Romans eventually decided that it was not worth the effort. The Emperor Hadrian, visiting Britain in 122 CE, ordered the construction of a wall across the narrowest point of northern England, from the Solway Firth in the west to the Tyne estuary in the east, a distance of around 73 miles. Hadrian's wall was not simply a military barrier. It was a statement of imperial intention, a declaration of where Roman civilization ended and barbarism began. It was manned by a permanent garrison of around 10,000 soldiers, drawn from across the empire, including Syria, North Africa, Germany, and the Balkans. Parts of it stand today. You can walk along it. You can run your hand along the stones laid by soldiers who came from the banks of the Euphrates and the edges of the Sahara to stand guard on a cold northern wall in a province at the end of the world. Within the territory Rome controlled, the transformation was extraordinary. Cities rose where there had been none. Londinium, founded at a crossing point on the Thames, grew within a century to become the largest city north of the Alps. With a population of perhaps 60,000 at its peak, Eboracum, modern York, became a legionary fortress and provincial capital. Aquae Sulis, modern Bath, was built around the natural hot springs that the Britons had already considered sacred, and the Romans built there one of the great temple and bath complexes of the western provinces. Roads were laid in straight lines across the landscape, connecting military bases and trading towns, facilitating movement and commerce and the rapid deployment of troops. The Roman roads were so well built that many of them remained in use as the primary routes across Britain for over 1,000 years after Rome departed, and some of them underlie modern roads today. The Roman period is also when Britain first enters the written historical record in any meaningful way. The Romans wrote things down. They kept administrative records, military records, personal correspondence. A cache of writing tablets found at the site of Roman London, the Bloomberg tablets, includes shopping lists, legal documents, and personal notes. Scraps of daily life from people who lived in 1st and 2nd century Londinium, as mundane and as vivid as anything you might find in a modern desk drawer. Roman Britain was also Christian Britain, at least by the late period. Christianity reached the province in the 2nd or 3rd century, probably through traders and soldiers, and by the early 4th century, when the Emperor Constantine legalized Christianity across the empire, it was already established in Britain. Several British bishops attended early church councils. There were Christian communities in the major towns, and Christian symbols appear in the mosaics and wall paintings of Roman villas across the countryside. But Roman Britain was always contested. The tribes of the unconquered north, the Picts, raided south across Hadrian's Wall repeatedly. Coastal raiders from Ireland and from what would become Scotland's western seaboard harassed the western and northern shores, and within the province there were occasional moments of catastrophic resistance. In 60 or 61 CE, a woman named Boudica, queen of the Iceni tribe of what is now Norfolk, led a revolt that came terrifyingly close to driving the Romans out of Britain entirely. The immediate trigger was the Roman seizure of her late husband's territory and the savage mistreatment of herself and her daughters. The broader cause was the systematic exploitation and humiliation of the British tribes by Roman administrators and moneylenders. Boudicca assembled an army of perhaps 100,000 warriors and marched on the Roman towns. She burned Camulodunum to the ground. She destroyed the legionary detachment sent to stop her. She burned Londinium, and the archaeological evidence of that burning is still visible in a layer of red ash beneath the streets of modern London. She burned Verulamium, modern St. Albans. Roman accounts claim she killed 70,000 people in those three cities. The numbers are probably exaggerated, but the destruction was real and catastrophic. The Roman governor, Gaius Suetonius Paulinus, returning from a campaign in Wales, assembled what forces he could, perhaps 10,000 soldiers, and met Boudicca's army somewhere in the Midlands. The site of the battle has never been definitively identified, but the Romans won. Their superior discipline and formation tactics allowed them to hold against the British charge and then counterattack devastatingly. Boudicca died shortly after, either by suicide, by illness, or in the battle itself, depending on which source you read. Britain remained Roman, but Boudicca was never forgotten. She stood in resistance. She stood in fury. And when Britain later needed a symbol of defiance, she was always there, waiting to be invoked. The Romans left Britain not in a single moment, but in a long, complicated, disintegrating process. By the late 3rd century, the Western Roman Empire was under enormous pressure. Barbarian confederacies were pressing on its borders. Internal political instability produced a rapid succession of emperors, some lasting only months. Tax revenues were falling. The military was overstretched. In Britain, as elsewhere in the empire, the administrative and economic infrastructure began to fray. In 410 CE, the emperor Honorius, beset by crises on multiple fronts, wrote to the cities of Britain and told them to see to their own defense. This has traditionally been taken as Rome formally abandoning Britain, though the reality was more complex. Roman institutions did not vanish overnight. Some towns maintained something like urban life for decades afterward. Some wealthy Britons continued to live in Roman-style villas well into the 5th century. The process of what we call the end of Roman Britain was slow, uneven, and locally variable, but the legions did not return. The subsidies stopped. The administrators departed. The roads, no longer maintained, began to erode. The towns, without the trade networks and administrative machinery that had sustained them, began to empty. And into the political vacuum left by Rome's withdrawal came new forces. The Anglo-Saxons. The name covers several groups: Angles from what is now the Schleswig region of northern Germany, Saxons from what is now the northwestern German coast, Utes from what is now Denmark. They had been raiding Britain's eastern shores for decades, even before the Romans left. Now, beginning in the early 5th century, they began to settle. This process has generated more historical controversy than almost any other question in British history. The older view, drawn from sources like the monk Gildas writing in the 6th century, saw it as a catastrophic conquest, the heroic British resistance crumbling before the Saxon tide, the Christian civilization of Roman Britain destroyed and replaced. Later scholars, working with archaeological evidence, suggested a more gradual picture of immigration and cultural change, with the existing British population largely staying put and gradually adopting the language and material culture of the newcomers. The genetic evidence coming in from recent decades of ancient DNA analysis suggests something closer to the older picture than archaeologists had expected. There was a very substantial population movement from the continent. The genetic profile of early medieval Britain shifts dramatically toward continental Northern European ancestry. Not everything the older sources claimed, but something real and significant. New people came in very large numbers, and they brought their language with them. Anglo-Saxon, the ancestor of modern English, was the language of the immigrants, and it replaced, across what would become England, the Brittonic languages that had been spoken there. Those languages survived in Wales, in Cornwall until the 18th century, in what is now Cumbria rather longer. But in the lowlands and plains that the Anglo-Saxons settled most densely, Brittonic speech died out within a few generations. The memory of what had been lost did not die with it. Among the Welsh, who called themselves the Brythoniaid, the Britons, and called the Anglo-Saxons the Saeson, the foreigners, the tradition of British resistance survived in legend and story, and at the centre of that tradition, like a sun around which lesser stories orbited, was the figure of a warlord who had held back the Saxon tide. Arthur. Whether a historical Arthur existed is a question to which we will probably never have a definitive answer. The earliest references to him in Welsh poetry and annals suggest a military leader, a war chief who fought a series of battles against the Saxons in the late 5th or early 6th century. He is not a king in the earliest sources. He is a war leader. He is fierce and brilliant and mortal. He wins battles and he dies in battle, at a place called Camlan, against a man named Medrawt. That is all we have, historically. The Camelot, the Round Table, the Holy Grail, the courtly love, the sorcerer Merlin in his familiar form, all of that came later, built up by centuries of storytelling, most of it by medieval French and English writers who were not much interested in history and very interested in chivalric romance. The Arthur of legend is almost entirely a medieval invention, but the shadow of that original figure, the desperate 6th century British warlord fighting to hold back the dark, is real. And the fact that his memory survived 15 centuries, passed down through Welsh oral tradition into world literature, tells you something about the depth of what was felt when Roman Britain gave way to Anglo-Saxon England. Something was lost, something great and civilized and remembered, and people did not stop mourning it for a very long time. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms that emerged from the chaos of the 5th and 6th centuries were not a unified state. They were a patchwork: Northumbria in the north, Mercia in the Midlands, East Anglia in the east, Wessex in the south, Kent and Essex and Sussex in the southeast, and smaller kingdoms that waxed and waned. They fought each other constantly. They traded with each other. They intermarried. They were, in their way, building something, even when they could not see it. Christianity returned to England from two directions simultaneously. From the south, Pope Gregory the Great sent a monk named Augustine to Kent in 597 CE, with a mission to convert the English. He was received by King Ethelbert of Kent, whose Frankish queen was already Christian, and established a church at Canterbury, which remains to this day the mother church of the Church of England. From the north, Irish monks, following the tradition of the extraordinary monk Columba, who had established a monastery on the island of Iona in 563, had been spreading Christianity through Northumbria and beyond. These two strands of Christianity met in England and had to negotiate their differences, most famously at the Synod of Whitby in 1664, where the Roman and Irish traditions argued over the calculation of Easter and the shape of monks' tonsures, and where the Roman tradition won. It sounds impossibly trivial, a great church council arguing about the date of a holiday and the haircuts of monks. But it was not trivial at all. It was a question of which tradition, which authority, which connection to the wider Christian world would define the English church. And the answer shaped the relationship between England and Rome for the next 900 years. The Anglo-Saxon period produced extraordinary things. The Lindisfarne Gospels, created by a monk named Edfrith around 715 CE on the island of Lindisfarne, off the Northumbrian coast, is among the most beautiful manuscripts ever created. 4 Gospels, written in a precise, elegant script and illuminated with pages of staggering intricacy, carpet pages of interlaced patterns and zoomorphic decoration that reward hours of looking and still have not given everything away. It is in the British Library today. You can see photographs of every page online. Nothing in the photographs fully conveys what it is to look at the actual pages. The Sutton Hoo ship burial, discovered in Suffolk in 1939, revealed the burial of a great Anglo-Saxon king, probably Redwald of East Anglia, interred in a full-size ship under a great earthen mound with a treasure that stands as one of the most spectacular archaeological discoveries ever made in Britain. A helmet of iron and bronze decorated with interlaced animals, a great shield, a sword with gold and garnet fittings, a massive hanging bowl, silver spoons, a ceremonial whetstone. It was a burial fit for a god, and the man inside had clearly thought himself very close to one. And then there is Beowulf. Beowulf is the great epic poem of Anglo-Saxon England, written in Old English, surviving in a single manuscript now held in the British Library. It tells the story of a warrior named Beowulf who fights a monster named Grendel and Grendel's mother, and finally, a dragon, and who, in fighting the dragon, gives his life. It is a poem about heroism and mortality, about the transience of glory and the permanence of loss. It is set in Scandinavia, not in England, but it was written in England by an English poet of genius, whose name we do not know, and it carries within it the deepest values of the world that made it: courage, loyalty, generosity, the willingness to face impossible odds. You can feel, in Beowulf, the world of Sutton Hoo, the world of men in halls, drinking by firelight, listening to poets, knowing that the darkness outside was real, and that the monsters in it were only sometimes metaphorical. The darkness outside was about to become very real indeed. In the summer of 793 CE, something happened on the island of Lindisfarne that sent a shock through the whole of Christian Europe. A fleet of longships appeared off the coast. The men aboard them were pagans from Scandinavia. They landed, they killed, they plundered, they burned. The monastery of Lindisfarne, one of the great centres of Christian learning in the north, was devastated. The monks who were not killed were taken as slaves. The treasures accumulated over more than a century of extraordinary craftsmanship were carried away. The Viking Age had reached Britain. The Vikings, as we call them, though they called themselves by their own tribal and regional names, were the peoples of Scandinavia. Danes, Norwegians, Swedes. They were motivated by a complex mix of factors: population pressure at home, the promise of wealth abroad, the improvements in shipbuilding technology, particularly the development of the longship, a shallow-drafted, flexible sea-going vessel that could cross the open Atlantic and navigate the shallowest river, that opened the world to Scandinavian adventurism. They were not simply destroyers, though they destroyed. They were traders as well as raiders. In the east, Swedish Vikings followed river routes deep into Russia and the Byzantine world, establishing the trading state that would become Russia. In the west, Norwegian Vikings settled Iceland, Greenland, and briefly, remarkably, the coast of North America, 5 centuries before Columbus. Danish Vikings focused heavily on the British Isles and on the Frankish kingdoms of what is now France. In Britain, the initial period of raiding gave way, in the second half of the 9th century, to something far more serious: conquest and settlement. A great army of Danes invaded in 865, and over the following years they destroyed the kingdoms of Northumbria, East Anglia, and much of Mercia. The old Anglo-Saxon world was being swept away. Only one Anglo-Saxon kingdom survived intact: Wessex, in the south, under a king who would be remembered as Alfred the Great. Alfred came to the throne of Wessex in 871, amid a crisis that looked like the end. The Danes were pressing from the north and east, winning battles, seizing towns. In the winter of 878, a Danish surprise attack drove Alfred out of his own kingdom entirely. He took refuge in the marshes of Somerset, a fugitive king with a tiny retinue, in a landscape of waterlogged islands and reed beds. It is from this period that the most famous of all the stories told about Alfred comes, the story of the burned cakes. Alfred, sheltering with a peasant woman who did not know who he was told to watch the cakes baking on the hearth. Lost in thought about his kingdom, he let them burn. The woman scolded him vigorously before finding out she had just rebuked the King of Wessex. The story is almost certainly not true in any literal sense, but it has survived because it says something felt to be true about Alfred, that he was a man burdened by impossible responsibility, whose mind was always on the problem of how to save his people, and who was, in the end, human enough to make mistakes. Alfred did not remain in the marshes. He regrouped, he rebuilt his forces, and in the spring of 878, he met the Danish king Guthrum at the Battle of Edington and won a decisive victory. The peace that followed, the Treaty of Wedmore, established a boundary, the Danelaw, that divided England. The Danes would rule the north and east. Alfred and his successors would rule the south and west. And Guthrum himself agreed to be baptized as a Christian, with Alfred standing as his godfather. It was not the end of Viking pressure on Britain. It was not even close to the end. But it was a survival, and from that survival, Alfred built something remarkable. He reformed his kingdom's defences, building a system of fortified towns, burhs, across Wessex that could serve as refuges and defensive positions. He rebuilt and restructured the army. He overhauled the law. He invited scholars from across Europe to his court and himself translated Latin works of learning into Old English, because he believed his people needed to be educated in their own language, not just in the Latin of the Church. He oversaw the beginning of what would become the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, a remarkable annalistic record of English history that continued to be maintained for centuries after his death. Alfred died in 899. He was the only English monarch ever to receive the epithet Great. Whether any other monarch earned it more fully is debatable. What is not debatable is that without him, there might have been no England at all. His successors continued the work he began. His son Edward the Elder and his grandson Athelstan pressed northward into the Danelaw, reconquering territory and asserting authority over kings and lords across the island. In 927, Athelstan received the submission of the kings of Scotland and Wales and the Viking rulers of Northumbria at a meeting at Amont Bridge. He styled himself Rex Totius Britannia, King of all Britain. It was an exaggeration, but it pointed towards something real. For the first time, there was an entity that could be called England. The Vikings were not finished with it yet. In the early 11th century, a Danish king named Snut conquered England and ruled it, and proved remarkably good at it. He ruled England, Denmark, and Norway simultaneously, and maintained the Anglo-Saxon administrative system, the church, and the legal order with pragmatic efficiency. His most famous moment came when, according to legend, he sat at the seashore and commanded the tide not to come in, to demonstrate to his flattering courtiers that a king's power has limits, that only God commands the sea. Whether he did this or not, it is remembered because it is the kind of thing that, had he done it, would have defined him perfectly. He was a man who understood the gap between power and its pretensions. Nut died in 1035, his empire fragmented, and within 30 years, England had a new kind of visitor. The year is 1066, and it is the most famous year in English history. Edward the Confessor, the Anglo-Saxon king, died in January without a clear heir. 3 men claimed the throne: Harold Godwinson, the most powerful earl in England, who Edward had apparently designated on his deathbed; Harold Hardrada, King of Norway, who claimed descent from Canute gave him a right to rule; and William, Duke of Normandy, who claimed that Edward had promised him the throne years earlier, and that Harold had personally sworn an oath to support his claim. Harold took the crown immediately after Edward's death. He knew what was coming. What came was two invasions, nearly simultaneous from opposite directions. In September, Harald Hardrada landed in the north with a large Norwegian army, allied with Harald's own treacherous brother, Tostig. Harold marched north with stunning speed, covering almost 200 miles in 4 days, and caught the Norwegian army unprepared at Stamford Bridge in Yorkshire. The battle was a complete English victory. Harald Hardrada and Tostig were both killed. The Norwegian threat was extinguished. Harold had exactly 4 days to celebrate, before news arrived that William of Normandy had landed on the south coast. Harold marched south again, that same extraordinary speed, and gathered his army near Hastings on the Sussex coast. He probably should have waited longer, given his men more rest, allowed more forces to join him. But perhaps he feared that William's army, living off the land, would devastate his kingdom the longer he delayed. The battle fought on October 14th, 1066, a few miles from the town of Hastings, lasted all day and was extraordinarily close. The Norman cavalry and archers faced the English infantry shield wall, dug into a ridge, and through most of the morning and early afternoon, the shield wall held. At several points during the day, portions of the Norman army fled, apparently thinking the battle lost, and the English broke formation to pursue them, which was fatal. Whether these flights were real retreats or deliberate feints, they were exploited with deadly effectiveness. Harold was killed in the late afternoon. The sources disagree on how he died. The Bayeux Tapestry, the extraordinary embroidered record of the Conquest, made within a generation of the events it depicts, shows a man pulling an arrow from his eye, though the caption is ambiguous. By nightfall, the English army had broken, and William held the field. He waited a short time, hoping the English would simply submit. When they did not immediately, he marched on London, devastating the countryside around it to demonstrate what resistance would cost. It worked. The remaining English leaders submitted at Berkhamsted, and on Christmas Day, 1066, William was crowned King of England in Westminster Abbey. The Norman Conquest was the last successful invasion of England, and it changed everything. The Norman ruling class that came with William spoke French. They worshipped in Latin. They built castles of stone, a technology barely known in Anglo-Saxon England, and planted them across the landscape as instruments of control. Within 20 years, the entire English land-owning class had been replaced. The great Anglo-Saxon earls and thanes were dead, exiled, or reduced to poverty. Norman barons held the land, Norman bishops held the church, and Norman lords administered the new royal bureaucracy. The English language did not die, but it was transformed. For 3 centuries, the ruling classes of England spoke French. The common people continued to speak English. The two languages coexisted, collided, merged. When they eventually fused into Middle English, and then into the early modern English of Chaucer and Shakespeare, they produced a language of extraordinary richness, with a vocabulary and a capacity for nuance that no single source language could quite match. Half of modern English vocabulary comes ultimately from French or Latin roots, absorbed in the Norman and later medieval periods. The other half is the old Germanic core. Every time you choose between ask and inquire, between kingly and royal, between holy and sacred, you are navigating the linguistic legacy of 1066. William consolidated his power with ruthless efficiency. The Domesday Book, commissioned in 1085 and completed in 1086, was a comprehensive survey of England's land and resources, unprecedented in its thoroughness. Who owned what, how much it was worth, how many peasants worked it, how many ploughs it needed. It was a tax record, but it was also something more, a declaration that the king knew and had written down the precise value of everything in his kingdom. Nothing like it existed anywhere else in Europe. It was extraordinary, and it was terrifying, and the English called it the Domesday Book because it felt to them like the judgment of God. inescapable and final. From the Norman conquest grew the medieval kingdom that we think of as the England of castles and cathedrals, of crusaders and barons, and the great chain of feudal obligation. The century and a half after William saw England ruled by Norman and then Angevin kings, the Angevins being the family that came to the throne with Henry II in 1154, rulers who were also powerful lords in France and who treated England as one part of a broader Atlantic empire. Henry II was one of the most energetic and effective rulers medieval England ever had. He reformed the legal system, establishing common law courts that applied the same law across the whole kingdom, a foundation of the English legal tradition that persists to this day. He fought with his barons, he fought with the church, he fought with his own sons. His conflict with the church reached its most dramatic and most terrible moment in December 1170, when 4 of his knights, apparently acting on a frustrated royal outburst, rode to Canterbury Cathedral and murdered the Archbishop Thomas Becket at the altar. Becket had been Henry's close friend and chancellor before Henry appointed him archbishop, expecting a compliant chief churchman and finding instead a man who took his new role with absolute seriousness and defied the king at every turn. Their falling out was bitter and prolonged. The murder shocked the Christian world. Henry did public penance. Becket was canonized within 3 years. Canterbury became one of the great pilgrimage sites of medieval Europe, drawing pilgrims from across Christendom to pray at Becket's shrine, a tradition that Geoffrey Chaucer would immortalize in the Canterbury Tales 2 centuries later. The Plantagenet dynasty, as we call the Angevin line, produced kings of vastly varying quality. Richard V, the Lionheart, who spent almost his entire reign abroad on crusade or in captivity and had almost no interest in England as such, but who became one of the great romantic legends of medieval kingship. His brother John, who inherited in 1199 and proved one of the most catastrophically inept rulers England ever endured, militarily incompetent, politically paranoid, financially rapacious, and possessed of a talent for alienating precisely the people he most needed to retain. John's failures culminated in a moment that shaped the constitutional history, not just of England, but of much of the Western world. In June 1215, on a waterlogged meadow called Runnymede on the banks of the Thames near Windsor, John met his rebellious barons and agreed to set his seal to a document called Magna Carta, the Great Charter. Magna Carta was not, in its immediate context, a great declaration of human liberty. It was a list of specific grievances and specific concessions, drawn up by powerful barons who wanted to limit royal power over themselves. Many of its clauses dealt with obscure feudal technicalities of no interest to anyone outside the narrow world of medieval baronage. But embedded within it were principles that would echo for centuries. The principle that no free man could be imprisoned or deprived of his property except by the lawful judgment of his peers. The principle that justice could not be sold, denied, or delayed. The principle that even the king was subject to the law. John repudiated it almost immediately and died the following year. But Magna Carta was reissued, revised, and confirmed many times by subsequent monarchs, and each confirmation embedded its principles more deeply into English legal and constitutional tradition. By the time Enlightenment philosophers and the founders of the American Republic were looking for precedents for limited government and rule of law, Magna Carta was waiting for them, centuries old and available. The meadow at Runnymede is still there. There is a memorial on it now. You can go and stand in that damp, nondescript field and feel the weight of what was agreed there, however imperfectly and however reluctantly, on a summer day 800 years ago. The 13th and 14th centuries in England were a time of extraordinary creativity and extraordinary catastrophe, sometimes simultaneously. The great Gothic cathedrals rose. Canterbury, begun even before the Conquest, but transformed and rebuilt repeatedly, reaching the form we recognize today across the medieval period. Lincoln, whose angel choir is among the finest examples of Gothic architecture in Europe. Salisbury, whose spire at 123 metres is still the tallest in Britain. Wells, Ely, York Minster. These buildings required generations of labour, enormous expenditure, and a faith in a future that their builders would never see. They were acts of collective ambition on a scale that is hard to comprehend from the inside of a modern, secular age. At the same time, the English crown was locked in long, expensive, and often unsuccessful wars. Edward Thurse, who ruled from 1272 to 1307, was one of the most formidable military commanders of the medieval age and one of the most ruthless. He conquered Wales, extinguishing its independence and imposing English rule through a ring of massive castles, some of the finest examples of medieval military architecture in Europe. He attempted to conquer Scotland and very nearly succeeded, but Scotland proved unconquerable. Scotland's resistance came to its defining moment at the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314, where Robert the Bruce's Scottish army defeated a much larger English force under the incompetent Edward II and secured Scottish independence for the next 3 centuries. The Declaration of Arbroath, sent to the Pope in 1320, was a remarkable statement of Scottish nationhood and the right of a people to resist oppression. It contains lines that were still being quoted in Philadelphia in 1776 by men drafting their own declaration. And then, in 1348, catastrophe arrived from the east. The Black Death reached England in the summer of 1348, probably first at the port of Melcombe Regis in Dorset. It spread from there with terrible speed, following trade routes and river valleys, reaching every corner of the country within a year. The plague was primarily the bubonic form, caused by Yersinia pestis bacteria transmitted through flea bites, though there were also pneumonic and septicemic variants that spread through the air and through blood. The mortality rate was staggering. Modern estimates suggest that between 1/3 and 1/2 of England's entire population died in the initial outbreak of 1348 to 1350. The scale of the loss is almost beyond comprehension. Every community in the country lost people. Many communities were devastated to the point of depopulation. Some villages were abandoned entirely, their fields unploughed, their houses collapsing, the people simply gone. The earthwork remains of those lost medieval villages can still be seen from the air across the English countryside. Humps and ridges in grass fields that were once streets and houses and lives. The Black Death was not a single event. It returned again and again across the following century. By 1450, England's population was perhaps half what it had been before 1348, and it would not recover to pre-plague levels until the 16th century. The social consequences were profound. Labour was suddenly scarce. Peasants who survived found, for the first time, that they had bargaining power over their lords. Wages rose. Serfdom, the binding of peasants to the land, became increasingly difficult to enforce and began its long decline. The rigidities of the feudal social order were cracked, not all at once, but irreversibly. Out of this disruption came new voices. John Wycliffe, an Oxford theologian, challenged papal authority and argued for the translation of the Bible into English, so that ordinary people could read it themselves. Ideas that made him a forerunner of the Reformation, dangerous in his own time, but prophetic. The Lollards, his followers, kept those ideas alive through persecution and into the next century. William Langland wrote Piers Plowman, a great allegorical poem about poverty and justice and the corruption of the church, in the English of ordinary people. And Geoffrey Chaucer, a royal official and diplomat who knew both the courtly world and the street, wrote the Canterbury Tales, a great, raucous, tender, satirical panorama of English society in all its variety, in an English that still sings. The 14th century also saw the beginning of what would become the Hundred Years' War, a conflict between England and France that lasted, with interruptions, from 1337 to 1453, and that produced both the greatest English military victories of the medieval period and, ultimately, the loss of almost all English territory in France. Crécy in 1346, Poitiers in 1356, Agincourt in 1415. At each of these battles, an English army, significantly outnumbered by the French, won crushing victories through the disciplined use of the longbow, a weapon that English and Welsh archers had spent decades mastering, and that could put an arrow through plate armor at 200 yards in the hands of a trained man. Agincourt, on October 25th, 1415, became the most celebrated English military victory of the age, and it became celebrated partly because Shakespeare made it so. Henry VIII, the young king who led that outnumbered army to victory against a French force several times its size, became, in Shakespeare's hands, the ideal of English kingship. Heroic, eloquent, personally courageous, touched by God. The speech before the battle, the St. Crispin's Day speech, is among the greatest pieces of writing in the English language, and it was written 2 centuries after the battle it commemorates. But it says something true, or something felt to be true, about what that day meant. Henry VIII died in 1422 at 35 before he could consolidate his victories. Within a generation, the English position in France had collapsed, helped along considerably by a young French woman from Lorraine named Jeanne d'Arc, who claimed divine instruction, inspired a French military revival, and was burned at the stake in Rouen in 1431 after being captured and sold to the English. She was 19 when she died. She was canonized in 1920. By 1453, England had lost virtually all of its French territories, except Calais. The 100 Years' War was over, and England had lost it. The defeat in France contributed to a period of domestic instability so severe that it tore the English ruling class apart. The Wars of the Roses, fought between 1455 and 1485, were a series of civil wars between 2 factions of the Plantagenet dynasty, the House of Lancaster, whose symbol was a red rose, and the House of York, whose symbol was a white rose. The names are romantic and memorable. The reality was dynastic politics of brutal cynicism, fought out in battles of savage intensity, with defeated nobles executed and their estates redistributed to the victors, only to be reversed when the tide turned. Henry VI, the Lancastrian king who had been on the throne since infancy, was gentle and pious and entirely unequipped for the brutal realities of medieval kingship. He suffered periodic episodes of mental illness that left him incapacitated. His queen, Margaret of Anjou, was fierce and capable, but deeply resented, a French woman fighting to preserve her husband's crown and her son's inheritance. The Yorkist Edward IV deposed Henry twice. Henry was murdered in the Tower of London in 1471, probably on Edward's orders. Edward died in 1483, leaving 2 young sons, Edward V and Richard, Duke of York, who disappeared into the Tower of London shortly after their father's death and were never seen again. The mystery of the princes in the Tower has never been definitively solved, but the weight of historical opinion points toward their uncle, the man who took the crown as Richard III. Richard III ruled for 2 years. He was killed at the Battle of Bosworth Field in August 1485, defeated by Henry Tudor, a relatively obscure Welsh-English nobleman with a Lancastrian claim to the throne. His body was buried in a Leicester friary, and when that friary was later dissolved, his grave was forgotten, and he lay under a Leicester car park for 500 years until archaeologists dug him up in 2012 and identified him through DNA analysis. His skeleton showed the scoliosis that had curved his spine, which Shakespeare, writing a century later under Tudor patronage, had inflated into a grotesque physical deformity to match the moral corruption the Tudors needed Richard to represent. He was not a hunchback, but he was not, in all likelihood, an innocent man. Henry Tudor became Henry VII, and with him began the dynasty that would define the popular image of the English monarchy more than any other: the Tudors. Henry VII was cautious, methodical, and brilliant at finance, a king who, having seized the throne by force, spent the rest of his reign making his dynasty too secure and too wealthy to be dislodged. He was not a glamorous figure. He left his son a kingdom at peace, a treasury full, and a dynastic claim reinforced by a marriage alliance with the old Yorkist line. His son was very glamorous indeed. Henry VIII came to the throne in 1509 at 17, tall and athletic and intellectually gifted, a young man who could compose music and debate theology and joust and hunt with equal enthusiasm. He was, in his early years, everything a Renaissance prince was supposed to be, and he destroyed, in the end, more of what he had inherited than any English king before or since, and remade what remained into something unrecognizable to his ancestors. The story of Henry VIII is not, at its core, a love story, though it has been told as one so many times that the romantic frame is almost inescapable. It is a story about power, about a king who wanted a male heir and would not accept that his wife could not give him one, about a man who could not distinguish between what he wanted and what God intended, and who, when the institutional church of Christendom told him he could not have what he wanted, simply created a new institution that would. Catherine of Aragon, Henry's first wife, had given him only one surviving child, Mary. Henry's case to Pope Clement VII for an annulment of the marriage was legally dubious and politically impossible, since Clement was effectively the prisoner of Catherine's nephew, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. Henry waited years for a dispensation that was never coming, and then he stopped waiting. Beginning in 1532 and culminating in the Act of Supremacy of 1534, Henry severed the English Church from the authority of Rome and declared himself the supreme head of the Church of England. The break was not driven by theology, at least not initially. Henry was no Protestant. He had written a book attacking Luther in 1521, for which the Pope had given him the title Defender of the Faith, a title English monarchs retain to this day. His break with Rome was administrative and dynastic, not doctrinal, but it opened a door that could not be closed again, because once the Pope's authority in England was rejected, the question of what authority would replace it became urgent, and into that question flooded all the theological ferment that had been building across Europe since Luther nailed his theses to the door in Wittenberg in 1517. The dissolution of the monasteries, carried out between 1536 and 1541 under Henry's chief minister Thomas Cromwell, was the most radical transformation of the English landscape since the Norman Conquest. The monasteries held perhaps a third of England's agricultural land. They were also the centres of education, of medical care, of hospitality, of art and manuscript production. Henry dissolved them, seized their wealth, sold their lands, and in many cases stripped their buildings for materials. The abbeys of Glastonbury and Fountains and Tintern and dozens of others were left as ruins, the great shells of their churches standing roofless against the sky. The monks dispersed, the treasuries emptied. Those ruins are picturesque today. They were traumatic then. Henry died in 1547, massive and diseased, having married 6 times. He had his male heir at last, in the son Jane Seymour had given him, Edward, who came to the throne at 9 years old and died of tuberculosis at 15. The Protestant Reformation accelerated rapidly under Edward's protectors. Then his Catholic half-sister Mary took the throne, restored the papal connection, and burned nearly 300 Protestants at the stake in 5 years, earning the name Bloody Mary, a name that has stuck. And then Elizabeth, Henry's daughter by Anne Boleyn, whom Henry had executed when Elizabeth was 3, took the throne in 1558 and ruled for 45 years and changed everything again. Elizabeth I is the ruler around whom myth and reality are most completely intertwined in all of English history. The Virgin Queen, Gloriana. The ruler who never married, who turned her unmarried state into a political and almost mythological identity, who navigated the impossible currents of 16th century European power politics for 4 decades, with a combination of intelligence, manipulation, occasional ruthlessness, and sheer force of personality. Her reign saw the flowering of what we call the English Renaissance. Philip Sidney, Edmund Spenser, Christopher Marlowe, and above all, William Shakespeare, who began his career in the last years of Elizabeth's reign and wrote his greatest plays in the reign of her successor, whose 37 plays and 154 sonnets represent the single greatest body of work in the English language, possibly in any language, written by a man from a small market town in Warwickshire, whose father was a glove maker. Shakespeare is, in some sense, the proof of what the English language had become by the end of the 16th century, a language that had started as the tongue of illiterate Anglo-Saxon peasants, that had absorbed Latin and Norse and French and kept reinventing itself through every cataclysm, had become, in Shakespeare's hands, an instrument of such range and precision and beauty that it could hold everything: the heights of tragedy, the depths of comedy, the subtlest movements of the human mind, the coarsest jokes of the marketplace. Elizabeth's reign also saw the beginning of English overseas expansion. The privateers who preyed on the Spanish treasure fleets with the Queen's quiet encouragement. The explorers who mapped the coast of North America. Walter Raleigh's failed attempt to plant a colony in Virginia. And in 1588, the dramatic defeat of the Spanish Armada, the great fleet Philip II of Spain sent to invade England, scattered by English ships and Atlantic storms and enshrined immediately in national myth as a providential deliverance. Elizabeth died in 1603, the last Tudor, leaving no heir. The throne passed to James VI of Scotland, great-great-grandson of Henry VIII's sister Margaret, who became James I of England, and with him came the Stuart dynasty and a new set of collisions. James I was a man of considerable intelligence and considerable limitations, a scholar king who wrote books on theology and witchcraft and the divine right of kings, and who managed, across his reign, to make the English Parliament rather more suspicious of Stuart intentions than was wise. His son Charles III made those suspicions catastrophically well-founded. The conflict between the Stuart monarchy and the English Parliament that culminated in civil war was not simply a conflict about taxation, though taxation was its immediate fuel, nor simply about religion, though religion was everywhere in it. It was a conflict about sovereignty, about who, ultimately, had the right to govern England. The king claimed to rule by divine right, accountable to God alone. Parliament claimed that the ancient laws and liberties of England required the king to govern with its consent. The civil war that broke out in 1642 between the Royalist forces, the Cavaliers, and the parliamentary forces, the Roundheads, was not a clean ideological conflict. It was messy, local, personal, full of men who switched sides and communities that suffered regardless of which side won. It pitted families against each other. It produced remarkable figures on both sides. Oliver Cromwell, a minor Cambridgeshire gentleman, turned parliamentary cavalry commander, proved one of the most militarily gifted leaders England has ever produced. His new model army, created in 1645, was a professional force of unprecedented discipline and effectiveness, driven by genuine religious conviction and capable of defeating royalist armies repeatedly in the field. Charles I was captured, tried for treason against his own people, and executed on a scaffold outside the banqueting house in Whitehall on January 30th, 1649. He wore two shirts so that he would not shiver from the cold and be mistaken for shivering from fear. He walked calmly to his death and reportedly said, as the axe fell toward his neck, one word, remember. The execution of a king was an event without precedent in English history. It sent a shock through every court in Europe, and it created a problem that the new Commonwealth could not solve. What to put in the place of the king? The interregnum, the 11 years between Charles's execution and the restoration of the monarchy, was a period of experiment and failure. England tried republican government, it tried military government, it tried Cromwell, who took the title Lord Protector and governed with increasing autocratic force until his death in 1658. It tried Cromwell's son, Richard, who lasted 9 months before resigning. It tried a return to parliamentary government, which descended immediately into faction. It tried nearly everything except a stable alternative to monarchy. When Charles II landed at Dover in May 1660 and was restored to his father's throne, the crowds that met him were enormous and genuinely enthusiastic. England had tried living without a king, and it had not liked it. Charles II was one of the most personally appealing of all English monarchs. Charming, witty, intelligent, sexually voracious, politically shrewd behind a carefully maintained air of negligence. He had learned from his father's fate. He did not push Parliament to the point of breaking. He maintained the official Protestant settlement while personally inclining toward Catholicism and finally converting on his deathbed. But the underlying constitutional tensions of the Stuart era were not resolved. They erupted again, finally and definitively, in 1688. James II, who came to the throne in 1685 after Charles's death, was a sincere and rigid Catholic in a Protestant country, a man who seemed constitutionally unable to leave well enough alone. He alarmed Parliament by promoting Catholics to positions of power, by suspending the laws that restricted Catholic worship, by claiming prerogative powers that Parliament had spent decades fighting to curtail. When his second wife gave birth to a Catholic son in 1688, ensuring a Catholic succession, the political class moved. They invited William of Orange, the Dutch Protestant ruler who had married James's Protestant daughter, Mary, to come to England with an army. William landed. James's army melted away. James fled to France, and Parliament declared that James had abdicated. The settlement that followed, the Glorious Revolution of 1688 and 1689, was in many ways the most consequential event in English constitutional history since Magna Carta. The Bill of Rights established that the monarch could not suspend laws, could not maintain a standing army without Parliament's consent, could not levy taxes without Parliament's approval. Parliament was supreme. The monarch reigned, but within limits that could not be exceeded. This was the constitutional settlement within which British parliamentary democracy developed. It was imperfect, deeply limited by our standards, utterly dominated by the landowning class, and entirely exclusive of most of the population. But it established the principle of government under law and parliamentary sovereignty in a form that proved durable, and it was admired and studied and envied across Europe and across the Atlantic in ways that shaped constitutions the world over. The Act of Union with Scotland followed in 1707, creating the Kingdom of Great Britain. Scotland retained its own legal system and its own church, but the parliaments were merged in Westminster. The union was controversial in Scotland and has remained so, but it also created a larger, more coherent state with greater resources and ambition than either nation could have mustered separately. The British Empire that grew to extraordinary scale across the 18th and 19th centuries was a joint enterprise, and Scottish merchants, soldiers, administrators, and intellectuals participated in it at every level. The 18th century in Britain was a century of paradoxes. It was the century of the Enlightenment, of reason and progress, and the confident application of human intelligence to the improvement of human life. It produced great scientists and great philosophers and great economists. Isaac Newton, who had done his most revolutionary work in the 1660s and 1680s, towered over the intellectual landscape of the early century. Adam Smith published The Wealth of Nations in 1776, inventing economics as a discipline and providing the theoretical foundation for the liberal capitalism that would come to dominate the world. James Watt improved the steam engine, creating the fundamental technology of the Industrial Revolution. Joseph Priestley and Humphrey Davy revolutionized chemistry. The Royal Society, founded in the Restoration period, became one of the greatest scientific institutions in the world. It was the century of the British Empire's great expansion. The 7 Years' War of 1756 to 1763, a conflict that was in many ways the first true world war, fought on multiple continents and oceans, established British dominance in India and North America, removed France as a major imperial rival, and set Britain on the path to global supremacy. James Cook's 3 voyages of Pacific exploration between 1768 and 1779 mapped the Pacific with extraordinary precision, established European contact with Australia and New Zealand, and extended the reach of British imperial ambition across the entire globe. It was also the century of the American Revolution, in which 13 British colonies in North America declared their independence, defeated the British Army with French assistance, and established the United States. The loss of the American colonies was felt as a profound humiliation in Britain at the time. It looks different in hindsight, a creative act of constitutional imagination, enabled by ideas that Britain itself had generated, producing a state that would eventually be Britain's most important ally and partner. And it was the century of the industrial transformation that would, within living memory, change the physical reality of Britain and then the world. The Industrial Revolution is one of the most significant events in human history. It began in Britain, for reasons still debated by historians. The particular combination of available coal, navigable rivers, a commercial culture, a patent system that incentivized invention, the proximity of key industries, the wealth generated by trade and empire. It began in textiles, with the mechanization of spinning and weaving in the cotton mills of Lancashire and Yorkshire. It accelerated with the steam engine, which allowed coal-powered machinery to do the work of hundreds of human beings. And it spread from textiles to iron and steel, from iron and steel to railways, from railways to everything. The landscape of Britain was transformed in ways that were simultaneously magnificent and terrible. Factories rose in cities that grew from market towns to industrial conurbations within decades. Manchester, the world's first industrial city, grew from a population of around 20,000 in 1750 to over 300,000 by 1850. The cities that grew were not beautiful. They were smoky, overcrowded, insanitary. The workers crammed into back-to-back terraced houses in conditions that would be recognized in any modern account of poverty. The human cost was devastating. Children worked in mines and factories from very young ages in conditions of real danger. Working hours were brutal. Industrial accidents were common. The cities bred disease. Cholera epidemics swept through the overcrowded slums of industrial England repeatedly in the 19th century. Life expectancy in the worst industrial districts was shockingly low, and yet the Industrial Revolution also created wealth on a scale never before seen in human history. It created a middle class that had not existed before, a class of manufacturers and merchants and professionals who did not own land but who accumulated capital and demanded political representation. It generated the tax revenues that eventually funded public health reforms, public education, and the beginnings of the welfare state. It created the physical infrastructure of the modern world, the railways, the canals, the telegraph, the machinery of global trade. The railways, built with extraordinary speed in the 1840s and 1850s, shrank Britain's effective geography to a fraction of its previous extent. A journey from London to Edinburgh that had taken 10 to 14 days by coach took 12 hours by train. Local time, which had varied across the country because the sun rises at different times at different longitudes, was standardized to Greenwich Mean Time because the railways required it. Britain got a single time zone. The age of the train had made the idea of local time obsolete. The British Empire reached its maximum extent in the Victorian era, and the Victorian era is the period through which modern Britain still, consciously or not, understands itself. Victoria came to the throne in 1837 at 18 and reigned until her death in 1901, the longest reign of any British monarch, until her great-great-granddaughter, Elizabeth II, surpassed it. Her reign encompassed more change, more growth, more expansion, and more contradiction than almost any comparable period in British history. The empire grew relentlessly. India, already under British commercial control through the East India Company, came under direct Crown rule after the Indian Mutiny of 1857, a rebellion that the British suppressed with great violence and that produced enormous anxieties about the nature of imperial rule. Africa was divided among European powers in the 1880s, with Britain taking enormous swaths of it. Egypt, Sudan, Nigeria, Kenya, South Africa, Rhodesia. By 1900, the British Empire governed more than 400 million people across every continent. The empire was built on trade and force, on ideologies of racial superiority and civilizing mission that were widely accepted within Britain and are now widely and rightly condemned. It brought real benefits to some it governed and imposed enormous suffering on others. It enriched Britain and impoverished many of those it colonized. It created systems of exploitation that shaped the economies of former colonies for generations after independence. These are not comfortable truths, but they are truths, and a complete account of British history cannot minimize them. The Victorian era also produced the reform movements that began, haltingly, to address the worst consequences of industrialization and imperial exploitation. The Factory Acts progressively restricted child labor and established minimum working conditions. The Great Reform Act of 1832 and subsequent Reform Acts expanded the franchise, though it would not be universal until 1928. The repeal of the Corn Laws in 1846 established free trade as the dominant economic principle. Robert Peel created the modern police force. Florence Nightingale transformed nursing and hospital management. William Wilberforce, whose movement had achieved the abolition of the slave trade in 1807, saw the abolition of slavery itself across the empire in 1833. The intellectual ferment of the Victorian period was extraordinary. Charles Darwin, whose On the Origin of Species, published in 1859, transformed humanity's understanding of itself and its place in the natural world. Charles Dickens, whose novels named and shamed the cruelties of industrial poverty with an emotional force that changed public opinion. John Stuart Mill, who argued for individual liberty and for the rights of women with a precision and power that still reads as radical. Thomas Hardy, who in his Wessex novels mourned what industrialization was destroying, even as it could not be stopped. The suffragettes, led by figures like Emmeline Pankhurst and her daughters, who campaigned with increasing militancy for women's right to vote, enduring imprisonment and force-feeding and social contempt, and who finally, partially, won. And all around, everywhere, the Victorians built. They built the great Gothic revival buildings that still define much of Britain's civic architecture. The Houses of Parliament, rebuilt after a fire in 1834 in the Gothic style, that the Victorians felt expressed the authentic spirit of the English nation. St Pancras Station, with its extraordinary red brick frontage, town halls across the industrial north. The great museums of South Kensington, funded partly by the proceeds of the 1851 Great Exhibition, which had itself been a triumphant declaration of British industrial and imperial supremacy to the watching world. Victoria died in January 1901. The long 19th century was over. The 20th was about to begin in earnest, and it would be unlike anything that had come before. There is a meadow at Thiepval in northern France, where on the first day of July 1916, 19,000 British soldiers died. In a single day, 19,000 dead. The Battle of the Somme, of which that day was the catastrophic opening, went on for 4.5 months and cost the British Empire over 400,000 casualties, killed, wounded, and missing. It did not break the German line. It advanced the British front by a few miles at most. It became, and remains, the defining symbol of industrial warfare's capacity to destroy human life on a scale that seemed, to those who endured it, to transcend all previous human experience of suffering. The First World War, which Britain entered in August 1914, following Germany's invasion of Belgium, was the event that ended the long Victorian confidence in progress, in empire, in the fundamental rightness of the civilization that Britain represented. The men who went to war in 1914 went, many of them, with genuine enthusiasm, with a sense of adventure and duty, with the expectation that it would be over by Christmas. What they found in the trenches of the Western Front was 4 years of mud and gas and artillery and the systematic industrial murder of young men. Britain mobilized on a scale never before attempted. Over 5 million men served in the British armed forces during the war. Around 700,000 died. The proportional loss among young men of the officer class, educated at the public schools and expected to lead from the front, was even higher. The generation that would have led Britain in the 1920s and 1930s was decimated. Wilfred Owen, who died in the war one week before the armistice, wrote poems that captured the reality of the trenches with an honesty that the propaganda could not contain. Siegfried Sassoon, who survived, wrote with savage irony about the gap between the experience of the men in the mud and the comfortable ignorance of the generals and politicians who sent them there. Robert Graves survived and wrote "Goodbye to All That," a memoir of the war so unsparing that it remained, for decades, one of the definitive accounts of what the war had actually been. The war ended in November 1918, and the peace was not the peace anyone had hoped for. The Treaty of Versailles, punitive in ways that would prove catastrophically short-sighted, imposed humiliating terms on Germany that created the resentments that brought Adolf Hitler to power 14 years later. The world the war had been fought to defend was gone. The world that replaced it was uncertain, anxious, and quietly preparing for something even worse. The interwar years in Britain were years of profound social change and economic hardship. The general strike of 1926, a 9-day stoppage in which workers across multiple industries halted the economy in solidarity with the striking miners, revealed the depth of class conflict that industrial Britain had been generating for a century. The Great Depression, which began with the Wall Street crash of 1929, spread across the Atlantic and hit the industrial north of Britain with devastating force. Mass unemployment in the mining and manufacturing communities of Wales, Scotland, and northern England created the conditions for the political movements that would define British politics for the next half-century. The Irish Free State had been established in 1922, following the brutal Anglo-Irish War, taking most of Ireland out of the United Kingdom and leaving behind a Northern Ireland partitioned along sectarian lines, a wound that would continue to bleed for generations. And across the Channel, the dark was gathering again. September 3rd, 1939. Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain spoke on the radio. Britain had demanded that Germany cease its invasion of Poland and withdraw its forces. No such message had been received. Consequently, he said, this country is at war with Germany. The Second World War, for Britain, lasted 6 years and cost around 450,000 lives, military and civilian combined. It came closer to British shores than the First World War had. German bombs fell on London and on Coventry and on Plymouth and on Liverpool and on dozens of other towns and cities across the country. The Blitz, the sustained German air campaign against British cities from September 1940 onward, killed over 40,000 British civilians and destroyed or damaged millions of homes. Yet the overwhelming memory of the Second World War in British culture is not one of defeat or suffering, but of survival and solidarity. The Blitz spirit, the community spirit, the image of Londoners sheltering in tube stations while bombs fell overhead, emerging each morning to clear the rubble and carry on. Much of that image was real. Much of it was also carefully managed by the wartime government, which understood the importance of civilian morale. The reality was more complicated, as reality always is. There was looting and social breakdown alongside solidarity and heroism. There was fear alongside courage, but the courage was also real, and the determination was also real. And something in the British national experience of those years has not yet been fully understood or processed or set aside. The man who, more than any other, personified Britain's wartime resistance was Winston Churchill, who became Prime Minister in May 1940, at the moment of maximum crisis, when France was collapsing and the British army was being evacuated from the beaches of Dunkirk, and invasion seemed not merely possible, but imminent. Churchill was one of the most complicated figures in British history. He was a brilliant, erratic, inspiring, at times appalling man. A racist imperialist who genuinely believed in the civilizing mission of the British Empire. A visionary strategic thinker who had been wrong about important things spectacularly and publicly. A man of enormous personal courage and enormous personal selfishness, who loved comfort and hated sleep and drank heroically, and whose bulldog energy animated a country that desperately needed animating. His speeches in the summer of 1940 are among the greatest in the English language. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender. The words sound, even now, like the ground shaking. Britain fought on. With American support, with Commonwealth forces from Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, India, and dozens of other territories, with the Free French and the Poles, and the Czechs and the Dutch fighting alongside them, and ultimately, with the vast weight of the Soviet Union and the United States in alliance, the Axis powers were defeated. Germany surrendered in May 1945. Japan surrendered in August 1945. Britain had won. And it was exhausted, nearly bankrupt, and about to undergo the most fundamental domestic transformation of its entire modern history. The general election of July 1945, held before the formal end of the war with Japan, produced one of the most dramatic results in British electoral history. The electorate, having endured years of war and hardship, did not reward Churchill and the Conservatives with a grateful mandate. They voted overwhelmingly for the Labour Party, led by the quiet, undramatic, utterly competent Clement Attlee. Attlee's government, in the 5 years between 1945 and 1950, built the welfare state that defines modern Britain more than any other single achievement. The National Health Service, created in 1948 under the formidable Welsh politician Aneurin Bevan, provides healthcare to every British citizen, free at the point of use, funded from general taxation. When it was created, Britain was nearly bankrupt, still rationing food that had been rationed during the war, borrowing money from the United States under terms it would not finish repaying until 2006. And in those conditions, Bevan and Attlee built a health service that has been described by polling data consistently and repeatedly as the institution that the British people love most. Not the monarchy, not the armed forces, not the church, the NHS. The NHS is imperfect, underfunded, overstretched, politically fought over, and perpetually in the news. It is also, for the great majority of British people, the concrete daily reality of the social contract. The promise that when you are sick, your society will care for you, regardless of whether you can pay. The post-war period also saw the rapid dissolution of the British Empire. India and Pakistan gained independence in 1947, in a partition accompanied by catastrophic communal violence that killed hundreds of thousands and displaced millions. Burma and Ceylon followed. In Africa, independence came to country after country through the 1950s and 1960s. The process was not always peaceful, and Britain's conduct in managing the transition carries a record of violence and bad faith that sits uneasily alongside the myth of an orderly, imperial sunset. By the 1970s, the empire was effectively over. What replaced it was the Commonwealth, a voluntary association of former British territories, and a Britain that was having to rediscover who it was in a world where it was no longer the centre of anything. That process of rediscovery was not comfortable. The post-war decades brought significant immigration from the Caribbean, South Asia, East Africa, and elsewhere, as people from former colonies came to Britain to fill labour shortages, drawn by the promise of opportunity in the mother country. They brought with them languages, religions, cuisines, and cultures that have transformed British life, particularly in the cities, in ways that are now so deeply woven into everyday experience that it is difficult to imagine the country without them. That transformation was not welcomed by everyone. There was racism, structural and personal, institutional and individual. There were riots. There was and is an ongoing national argument about identity and belonging and what it means to be British that has not resolved and may never fully resolve. The decades from the 1950s to the 1970s were also decades of relative economic decline, relative to Germany and France and Japan, countries that had been devastated by war and had rebuilt with newer industrial plant and different economic assumptions. British industry, much of it old and capital-starved, struggled to compete. Industrial disputes were frequent and bitter. The 1970s brought stagflation, the oil crisis, power cuts, the three-day week, refuse piling up in the streets during the winter of discontent of 1978 to 1979, and then, in 1979, Margaret Thatcher. Thatcher is the most divisive political figure in modern British history. Her admirers say she rescued Britain from managed decline, broke the power of the unions, unleashed entrepreneurial energy, restored national confidence, and forced necessary pain in the service of long-term gain. Her critics say she destroyed communities, entrenched inequality, dismantled institutions that took generations to build, celebrated a selfish individualism that corroded the social fabric and left wounds that have not healed 40 years later. Both are, in their way, right. She was consequential beyond almost any peacetime prime minister. She remade Britain, and you cannot explain modern Britain without her. The Falklands War of 1982, fought against Argentina over a group of islands in the South Atlantic, was unexpected and brutal and won, and it transformed her political fortunes and raised questions about British national identity that echoed through the following decades. The miners' strike of 1984 to 1985 was the decisive confrontation between her government and organised labour, fought over the closure of coal mines in communities that had no other economic base, and it destroyed the mining communities and the union movement together. Thatcher resigned in 1990, ousted by her own party. But the economic and political settlement she had created endured, contested and modified, but never quite reversed through the governments that followed. The last decades of the 20th century, and the beginning of the 21st are recent enough that you may have your own memories of them, or your parents' memories, or the memory of the news. The fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, which ended the Cold War that had shadowed every decade of Britain's post-war history. The IRA bombing campaign and the long, painful, improbable peace process in Northern Ireland that culminated in the Good Friday Agreement of 1998, bringing to an end the worst of the troubles that had killed over 3,000 people in 30 years of low-level civil conflict. The agreement required compromises from every side that would have seemed inconceivable a decade earlier. It held, and it remains, fragile and contested and important, the most significant British political achievement of the late 20th century. Tony Blair's new Labour government, elected in 1997 with a landslide, that felt to many like the end of something and the beginning of something else, promising a third way between old Labour statism and Thatcherite individualism, delivering constitutional reforms including devolution for Scotland and Wales and the Human Rights Act, and then, in 2003, taking Britain into the invasion of Iraq alongside the United States on the basis of intelligence about weapons of mass destruction that proved to be wrong. The Iraq War split the country. It saw the largest protest march in British history through the streets of London. Around 1 million people on a February day in 2003. It ended a period of post-Cold War liberal optimism and began a period of deepened political cynicism. Blair left office in 2007, his legacy forever marked by Iraq. The war itself dragged on for years, costing further lives and achieving outcomes that were difficult to describe as success by any metric. The 2008 financial crisis. The decade of austerity that followed as the coalition government of David Cameron cut public spending in ways that had cumulative and contested consequences felt most severely in the communities already most vulnerable. The Scottish independence referendum of 2014, in which Scotland voted to remain in the United Kingdom by 55% to 45%, a result that did not resolve the underlying question and left a significant portion of the Scottish population feeling that their future lay outside the Union. And then, in 2016, the vote that divided the country along lines of age and geography and education and identity that cut across the old left-right political spectrum and produced years of parliamentary paralysis and national argument. The Brexit referendum. 52% of those who voted chose to leave the European Union, an institution Britain had joined in 1973 and which had become, over 4 decades, deeply woven into the legal, economic, and regulatory fabric of British life. The reasons people voted leave were various and not reducible to a single narrative. Concerns about sovereignty, about immigration, about economic anxiety, about cultural change, about a sense that the political establishment had stopped listening. The reasons people voted Remain were equally various. The result was the narrowest of margins on a question of enormous consequence, and it produced a period of political dysfunction that lasted years. Britain formally left the European Union on January 31st, 2020. Then the COVID-19 pandemic, the lockdowns of 2020 and 2021, the extraordinary disruption of daily life, the grief of those who lost people they loved in conditions that prevented normal mourning, the pressure on the NHS, the scientific achievement of the vaccines, the relief of their arrival, a period of collective experience unlike anything in living British memory. The death of Queen Elizabeth II in September 2022, after a reign of 70 years, the longest in British history, created a moment of national pause that surprised many who had thought themselves indifferent to the monarchy. She had been there so long, so consistently, so completely a fixture of the national landscape, that her absence created a void whose dimensions were difficult to measure. The queues to view her lying in state stretched for miles. The grief was real, whatever its complicated relationship to the institution she represented. The accession of her son as Charles III marked the end of a chapter whose length no one alive had been able to remember the beginning of. The restoration of Charles II had not merely returned a king to the throne. It had returned wit, colour, pleasure, and a particular kind of English self-confidence that the Puritan years had suppressed, but not extinguished. The theatres reopened. Women appeared on stage for the first time in English history, replacing the boys who had played female roles since the time of Shakespeare. Samuel Pepys began keeping the diary that would become one of the great documents of everyday English life. A record of a man going to the theatre and eating and drinking and conducting affairs and worrying about his money and watching his city burn. London burned in September 1666. The Great Fire started in a bakery on Pudding Lane in the early hours of a September morning and spread, driven by a dry summer and an east wind, across the medieval city for 4 days. When it was over, 87 churches had been destroyed, including the old St. Paul's Cathedral, and 13,000 houses. Around 100,000 people were made homeless. Sir Christopher Wren designed the city that rose from the ashes. He designed 51 new churches and, above all, the new St. Paul's Cathedral, whose dome still defines the London skyline. A building of such proportion and authority that it remains, centuries later, one of the great architectural achievements of European civilization. Wren is buried beneath his cathedral, and his epitaph, in Latin, translates simply as, "If you seek his monument, look around you." That is exactly right, not just for the cathedral, but for the city itself, and for the nation that the city serves. The monument is the place. The monument is the accumulation of everything that was built and torn down and rebuilt across 15,000 years on these islands. The 18th century also gave Britain its greatest satirical tradition. Jonathan Swift, an Irishman who spent much of his career in London, wrote Gulliver's Travels in 1726, using the conventions of travel literature to savage the political and intellectual pretensions of his age with a ferocity that has never been surpassed. Alexander Pope refined the heroic couplet to a cutting instrument capable of reducing pompous men to dust in 10 syllables. Samuel Johnson, who compiled the first great dictionary of the English language and dominated the literary life of London for decades, combined enormous learning with robust common sense and a wit as sharp as any blade. Johnson's dictionary appeared in 1755, 9 years in the making, and it was a monument to the idea that the English language could be fixed, recorded, made rational. Johnson knew better. His own definitions were too personal, too funny, too alive to be merely philological. His definition of lexicographer, a writer of dictionaries, a harmless drudge. His definition of oats, a grain which in England is generally given to horses, but in Scotland supports the people. He was, in the best tradition of the English literary mind, too honest to take himself entirely seriously. The railways did something to Britain that is almost impossible to overstate in its significance. Before the railway age, the effective geography of Britain was enormous. It took the same amount of time to travel from London to Edinburgh as it took a Roman to travel from Rome to Carthage. The speed of communication was limited by the speed of a horse. News travelled at a gallop. People travelled at a walk. The world was, by any modern measure, immense. The railways compressed that world into something unrecognisable. George Stephenson, a self-educated engineer from Northumberland, built the Stockton and Darlington Railway in 1825 and the Liverpool and Manchester Railway in 1830, demonstrating that steam-powered passenger transport was practical, efficient, and faster than anything that had come before. The success of the Liverpool and Manchester line triggered a railway mania that within 20 years had covered Britain in a network of iron rails connecting every major city and reaching into every corner of the country. Isambard Kingdom Brunel, the most extravagantly ambitious engineer of the railway age, and arguably of any age, built the Great Western Railway between London and Bristol, drove a tunnel under the Thames, designed the SS Great Britain, the first ocean-going iron steamship, and the SS Great Eastern, the largest ship in the world at the time of its construction, and in doing all of these things, simultaneously, demonstrated a quality of imagination that was, by any reasonable standard, extraordinary. He was also frequently wrong, and the failures were as spectacular as the successes. The broad gauge track of the Great Western Railway, wider than the standard gauge that was becoming the norm elsewhere, had to be converted at enormous cost. The Great Eastern was a commercial failure, despite its technical brilliance. Brunel drove himself to a breakdown in trying to make it work, and died in 1859, at 53, having never quite stopped. That is the Victorian age in miniature, perhaps. Ambition so enormous it consumes itself. But the bridges stand, the tunnels hold, the trains still run where he ran them, and that is not nothing. The First World War produced literature of a kind Britain had not seen before. Not the literature of glory, though there was some of that in the early years. The literature of the trenches, the poetry of Wilfred Owen and Siegfried Sassoon and Edward Thomas, who recorded the experience of the war with an honesty that was unprecedented in the literature of any conflict. Owen's Dulciat Decorum Est, written in 1917 and published posthumously after his death in November 1918, describes a gas attack in the trenches with imagery so visceral and so specific that it remains, more than a century later, the most devastating indictment of war poetry ever written in English. Sassoon survived the war and tried, in an act of extraordinary personal courage, to end it by writing a public statement and refusing to return to the front, arguing that the war was being deliberately prolonged by those with the power to end it. He was not court-martialed, as might have been expected. He was sent to Craig Lockhart Psychiatric Hospital in Edinburgh, where the diagnosis was shell shock, a term that covered a range of experiences we would now recognise as PTSD, and where he met the young Wilfred Owen and effectively launched Owen's literary career. The hospitals were full of men who had experienced things the human mind was not equipped to process. The diagnosis of shell shock, contested and poorly understood, was the beginning of the long, slow recognition that the mind could be wounded as surely as the body, and that war was among the most reliable instruments for wounding it. The post-war period brought to Britain a cultural vitality that was, in its own way, as remarkable as any earlier age of achievement. The 1960s in Britain were not simply the Beatles, though the Beatles were extraordinary. They were a decade of transformation in almost every domain of cultural life: fashion, film, photography, graphic design, theatre, television, literature, all simultaneously loosening and remaking themselves. Carnaby Street and the King's Road, Mary Quant and Terence Conran. The Royal Court Theatre premiering The Angry Young Men, the kitchen sink realism that put working-class life on the stage and screen for the first time. The Pill, arriving in 1961 on the NHS, beginning the transformation of the social conditions of women's lives. The decriminalisation of homosexuality in 1967. The abolition of the death penalty. It was a decade that cracked open the social conservatism of the post-war years and let in a great deal of air. It was also a decade in which the contradictions of that conservatism became impossible to sustain, and a new set of contradictions, ones that are still being navigated, took their place. The 70s were less glamorous but no less significant. Punk rock erupted in 1976 as a deliberate rejection of everything that had preceded it, a noise of anger and nihilism that nonetheless produced some of the most vital music of the century. The Sex Pistols and The Clash and dozens of others expressed a contempt for the established order that was, in its way, as authentically British as anything that had come before. The same tradition of radical dissent that had produced the levellers in the 1640s and the Chartists in the 1840s, expressing itself in three-chord songs and safety pins. In science, the pace of British achievement did not slow. Francis Crick, working with James Watson and with the crucial but long under-acknowledged data of Rosalind Franklin, discovered the double helix structure of DNA at Cambridge in 1953, the most important scientific discovery of the 20th century. The Cavendish laboratory in Cambridge, where Rutherford had split the atom and Crick and Watson made their discovery, became one of the most productive scientific institutions in human history. The jet engine, pioneered by Frank Whittle in the 1930s. The World Wide Web, invented by Tim Berners-Lee, a British computer scientist working in Geneva, in 1989. The sequence of the human genome, achieved through a massive international collaboration that was led in part by the Sanger Centre in Cambridge. Britain's contributions to the science and technology of the modern world are so numerous and so fundamental that they have become invisible, absorbed into the furniture of everyday life. The internet browser you use to find this video, the jet plane that carries people across oceans in hours, the DNA test that tells people who they are and where they came from, the antibiotic that has saved uncountable lives since Alexander Fleming discovered penicillin in a London laboratory in 1928. All of it connected, however loosely, to this island and to the particular tradition of empirical inquiry and practical ingenuity that has characterized British intellectual life since the 17th century. There are things about Britain that statistics and chronologies cannot capture, things that only become visible when you step back far enough to see the whole. One of them is the extraordinary persistence of local identity within the national one. England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland are not simply administrative regions. They are distinct nations with distinct histories, distinct languages in the case of Wales and Scotland, distinct legal systems in Scotland's case, distinct cultural traditions and distinct self-conceptions. The union that holds them together is a political fact, but it is a political fact that sits uncomfortably on top of realities far older and far more stubborn. A Welsh speaker in Gwynedd today is using a language that's directly descended from the Brittonic speech of Iron Age Britain, the language that was spoken across most of the island before the Romans came, that survived Rome, that retreated before the Anglo-Saxons, that held on in the mountainous west and has held on ever since. When the Welsh Assembly, now the Senedd, conducts its business in Welsh as well as English, it is enacting a continuity of language across 2,500 years. That is not a small thing. That is an almost incomprehensible human achievement. Scotland's distinct identity has been expressed politically in ways that have grown more insistent in recent decades. The Scottish Parliament, reconvened in 1999 for the first time since 1707, has taken on increasing significance. The independence referendum of 2014 did not resolve the question of Scotland's constitutional future, and the Brexit vote, in which Scotland voted overwhelmingly to remain while the overall result was leave, deepened the sense that Scotland's political preferences were being overridden by English votes. The constitutional question has not gone away, and it will not go away. Northern Ireland's position is the most complex of all, the unresolved inheritance of centuries of English and British colonial intervention in Ireland, of plantation and dispossession and sectarian division, of a partition that was supposed to be temporary and has become a semi-permanent feature of the landscape. The Good Friday Agreement created the conditions for a peace that has largely held, but the underlying questions of identity and belonging and constitutional status remain as live as they were in 1921. These internal tensions are not signs of weakness. They are signs of complexity, which is itself a sign of depth. A country without internal tensions is a country without a history, or a country that has suppressed its history so effectively that the tensions have been driven underground. Britain's tensions are visible and audible and politically active, which means they are being negotiated rather than ignored. And at the centre of all of it, through all the centuries, through every age and every crisis and every transformation, the landscape itself. The landscape of Britain is a document written in 10,000 years of human occupation. The Iron Age hill fought on the hilltop above the motorway. The Norman church tower in the middle of the modern village. The Georgian terrace beside the Victorian warehouse beside the post-war council estate, beside the 21st century apartment block. Every era present simultaneously, layer upon layer, none of them fully erased by what came after. The hedgerows that divide the English countryside were laid down by enclosure acts of the 18th and 19th centuries, but some of them follow boundaries that are older than the enclosures, older than the manors, possibly as old as the Bronze Age. The lane that the hedgerow borders may follow a routeway worn by feet and hooves over millennia. The field it crosses may have been cultivated, in some form, since the Neolithic. The village at the end of the lane may have a name that is Anglo-Saxon in origin, built on a site that was already inhabited in the Iron Age, with a church that has stood in some form since the Norman period. All of it at once. All of it. Always. At once. That is Britain. That is what it is. A place where depth accumulates, where nothing is completely lost because something of everything remains, pressed into the soil, preserved in the archives, carried in the language, built into the walls of buildings you walk past without looking up. Look up. It is all still there. It is worth pausing, somewhere in the middle of all this history, to ask what it means to tell a story this long. Every account of history is a selection. The history of Britain in a single sitting is an act of radical compression, of choosing what to include and what to set aside, of deciding which threads to follow and which to leave tangled. A different narrator would have made different choices. A Welsh narrator, a Scottish narrator, a Nigerian narrator whose family came to Britain in the 1950s and built a life and raised children who are now as British as anyone. A Bangladeshi restaurant owner in Brick Lane who is keeping alive the curry traditions that were themselves a product of the British presence in the subcontinent. Each of them would tell a different story about what Britain is and what it has been. That is not a problem with this story. That is the truth of history itself. It is always told from somewhere, always by someone with a particular position in relation to the events being described. The best any storyteller can do is be honest about the limitations of their perspective and leave space for the voices they cannot fully speak for. So let me acknowledge, what we have told tonight is primarily the story of England, with Scotland and Wales and Ireland appearing as they intersect with that central story, but never quite receiving the full depth of attention their own histories deserve. A full account of Scottish history, from the Iron Age to the present, would take as long as this. A full account of Welsh history, with its extraordinary linguistic survival, its distinct religious tradition, its coal and slate and industrial heritage, would take as long again. A full account of Irish history, the longest and most consequential story of British imperial intervention, would take longer than both. These are the books and documentaries that exist and that deserve your attention if the history of these islands matters to you, as I hope tonight has made it matter. The history of any place is inexhaustible. That is the most honest thing you can say about it. You can spend a lifetime with Britain's history, following one thread into the depths until it disappears, and then emerging and picking up another, and never reach the end. Every village has its history. Every family has its history. Every field has its history, if you know how to read it. The story does not end, it only pauses to let you sleep. And so, we have travelled tonight from the footprints in the coastal sediment at Happisburgh to the staterooms of Buckingham Palace, from the ice that covered everything to the parliament that debates everything, from the flint tools of people whose names we will never know to the named, remembered, argued over faces of modern politics. 15,000 years, these islands, these complicated, stubborn, creative, sometimes brilliant, sometimes terrible, endlessly productive people. A Britain that is still becoming something, still working out what it is and what it owes and what it believes in and where it belongs in a world it no longer governs and can no longer pretend to dominate. That is not a comfortable place to be, but it is an honest place, and it is not without its resources. The English language, which began as the tongue of 5th century immigrants in the flooded flatlands of East Anglia, is now the closest thing the world has to a common tongue, spoken in some form by an estimated 1.5 billion people. The common law tradition, forged in the medieval courts and extended across centuries, has shaped the legal systems of dozens of nations. The parliamentary model, however imperfectly it has worked in practice, has been studied and adapted and adopted in countries the world over. The scientific tradition, from Newton to Faraday, to Darwin to Crick and Watson, has contributed more to humanity's understanding of the physical world than any comparable tradition on Earth. And the literature above everything, from Beowulf to Shakespeare to Austen to Dickens to Woolf to Orwell and beyond, in an unbroken thread of astonishing richness, a literature that has named and examined the human condition with a precision and a power that is the greatest of all the gifts this small, foggy, complicated island has given to the world. The ice came and it retreated. The sea rose and cut the island off. And on that island, every kind of human story that has ever been told has been told. Invasion and resistance, conquest and accommodation, faith and doubt, poverty and wealth, war and peace and war again, catastrophe and rebuilding and catastrophe again. Every age that seemed like the end turned out to be the beginning of something else. That is what this island's history is. A story that does not end because it has not ended. A story still being written, tonight, by people whose names will one day be in the history books of an England and a Britain we cannot yet imagine. But the story goes on. It always has. If you are still with me, I hope you found something tonight worth the staying awake for. And if you are drifting, let this be what follows you into sleep. That this island, this small, improbable fragment of rock and rain and human persistence, has been producing remarkable things for longer than almost any place on Earth, and it has not stopped. Good night. And if the history of these islands is something you come back to, please subscribe. Leave a comment and tell me which era you find most fascinating. Every response gets read, every voice gets heard. That is more than could be said for most of the history we covered tonight. But we keep trying. Good night. The soil of Britain has been worked continuously for 6,000 years. The same fields, generation after generation, ploughed and sown and harvested and left fallow and ploughed again, by hands whose names are almost entirely unknown to us. The Neolithic farmer who cleared the first trees from a hillside in what is now Wiltshire. The Bronze Age woman who carried water to her roundhouse on a morning 6,000 years ago. The Roman soldier, posted far from home, who carved his name into a stone at Hadrian's Wall so that someone, sometime, might know he had been there. The medieval peasant who survived the Black Death when half his village did not and kept farming because there was nothing else to do. The mill worker in 19th century Lancashire who fed her children with money, earned in conditions that would appall a modern workplace inspector, and somehow found time, on Sunday afternoons, to teach them to read. All of them are in the soil. All of them are in the language. All of them are in the stone of the walls and the grain of the wood of the older buildings and the water of the rivers that have been running to the sea since before the first human set foot on this island. The story is long. It is not over. It is yours, if you want it. Good night, and thank you.